This is without a doubt the most important video I'm releasing that's going to help you with your fantasy draft, because we are talking about the must-have players, and there's 10 of them that you need to be targeting in your draft this year if you actually want to take home a fantasy championship. And it's starting off right away with a tight end, which sounds absolutely weird to do that. It's Dalton Kincaid, the tight end for the Buffalo Bills, but here's the thing. I think that this guy is way more than just a tight end. I think there's a world where he is the #1 passing game option for the Bills this year and Josh Allen, because look at this right here. The Bills have the second most vacated targets this season. It just means targets that they have to replace from last year, with Stefon Diggs and Gabe Davis being the main guys now gone, two starting wide receivers for the past 4 years for this team. And then you can see here, vacated yards over 1,300, nearly 1,400, the second most. So there's a lot of opportunity to go around here. And of course, the Bills added some players. They're not just going to go into the season with those two guys missing and not replace them, right? You can see here on the team changes page in the fantasy blueprint, which a bunch of people have access to, they drafted Keon Coleman in the second round of the NFL draft after trading down a couple of times, and wide receiver Curtis Samuel, who has played with Joe Brady, their offensive coordinator for the Bills, in the past during their time with the Carolina Panthers. So this is an interesting offense you have right now. You have those two guys I just mentioned. You have Khalil Shakir entering his third year on this offense, and then you have Dalton Kincaid entering year 2. And when we look at this Bills receiver core even more, those names I just mentioned, like, it's nowhere near anybody as a clear-cut #1 option. Right now in training camp, they're rotating through these guys. Even Matt Collins is getting a lot of playing time on the outside, competing with Keon Coleman. Keon Coleman seeing some slot usage. So depending on the day, they're being used in different ways. The veteran here is Curtis Samuel, in terms of a guy who is experienced and has success in an NFL offense in a couple of different wide receiver positions, the slot and out wide. But even with those guys being added, I don't think they're going to be able to replace the 241 targets that Gabe Davis and Stefon Diggs have left behind. So what does this mean? Well, it means that other players are probably going to see larger roles to take on that workload that those receivers are leaving behind. Khalil Shakir, a wide receiver we mentioned who was on the team last year, and also Dalton Kincaid. And Dalton Kincaid, let's not forget, as he enters year 2, the Bills spent the first round pick on this guy last year, 25th overall. He was taken right after all the other wide receivers went off the board, and Quentin Johnston and Zay Flowers and even Jackson Smith-Njigba. So they drafted him kind of to like be a wide receiver last year. And the fella showed some serious flashes as a pass catching threat despite having to play next to Stefon Diggs last year, and now he's gone. As you can see right here on Player Profiler, he averaged nearly 6 targets per game. Again, for any tight end, that's fantastic. Top 10 in the NFL, borderline top 5 on a per game basis, 91 total targets while playing next to Stefon Diggs. And in his rookie season, in a part-time role because he split some time with Dawson Knox, he finished as the number 14 tight end in fantasy despite scoring just 2 times. Based on his usage, he should have seen about 4 or 5 touchdowns, which easily would have had him as a top 10, borderline top 5 tight end, which is around where he goes this year, and I think that's justified. Now, he was a rookie last year, so the season started kind of slow, but from week 6 on is where he really took off, and during that time, Dawson Knox was out for a few games, and he benefited Dalton Kincaid a lot. During this time, Kincaid averaged 6.7 targets per game and 11.2 fantasy points, which both of those metrics would have ranked in the top 5 last year, and 6.7 targets per game, if I have it right here, would have ranked 6th amongst all tight ends. And again, this is with Gabe Davis on the field. This is with Stefon Diggs on the field. Guys that Josh Allen was comfortable throwing to the past 4 seasons. Those security blankets, if you will, are now gone. Now, of course, the biggest threat to Dalton Kincaid's role is Dawson Knox, who himself is also a talented player. Not nearly the pass catcher, but well-rounded tight end for sure. If he's going to be on the field, that's going to hurt Dalton Kincaid. And right now in training camp, you'll see some tweets come out about how Dawson Knox is going to be a big part of the offense still, but that's to be expected. Don't read too far into that. He's a talented player. He'll be on the field. It's just how much. Because as a rookie, we saw Dalton Kincaid out there for 83% of the team's routes. When they were out there throwing a pass, he was running a route 83% of the time. That's solid, but if this number can get even higher now with those other pieces gone and push closer to 85 to 90%, that's usually where you see a top 5 tight end finish. Right now, in my opinion, I think that Dalton Kincaid, in like the 5th round, you get an elite tight end with like a wide receiver type usage. I think he's a must-have. And then the next guy that I think is a must-have goes in the early 2nd round. So if you're anywhere between like picks 7 or 8 in your fantasy draft into the early 2nd round, I think that Garrett Wilson should be starred. He should put an exclamation point by him. You should do everything you possibly can to land Garrett Wilson on your team. And look, this choice can be difficult. At the end of the 1st round, everybody's a stud. You're going to have guys like Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, great running backs, even wide receivers like Drake London, A.J. Brown. But Garrett Wilson, listen up. Emphasize him, get him, you want him. God damn, I just yelled and I think I popped a blood vessel in my neck. What the fuck? Look, I'm not sure there's a better wide receiver in the entire NFL who has not been able to show his full potential like a Garrett Wilson because of his quarterback situation. And we're about to take a look at this quarterback situation. And let me just say, if you're eating food, if you're eating lunch right now, that's great. I appreciate you spending your lunch with us here on this Alvesher YouTube channel, but you might get a little bit nauseous and dizzy when I show you this quarterback list. Fair warning, but the New York Jets quarterbacks the last couple of years for one, Garrett Wilson, Zach Wilson. We know that for 20 games. Mike White, White, okay, he had a great flash and then he got a nice contract with the Dolphins. Good for him. Joe Flacco, meh. Trevor Siemian, the Tim Boyle experience. Do you remember the Tim Boyle experience? And then 4 snaps with Aaron Rodgers on offense. That's the one that we want to get back this year, and we will get back this year, but the quarterbacks have not been great. Because you know what all those guys have in common outside of the 4 snaps of Aaron Rodgers? They're not starting quarterbacks this year. Most of them are not even QB2s for a team this year. They're either out of the league or quarterback 3s. But despite playing with terrible quarterbacks last year, mostly Zach Wilson for half or more than half of the season, we still saw Garrett Wilson see the 4th most targets, average basically 10 targets per game. He is elite at earning targets. 168 last year. This guy was fantastic. And not only that, he never left the field. The big thing, if you're on the field, that's a skill set that leads to upside. 666 routes, knock on wood, oh boy. Number 1 in the NFL. I mean, this guy's just always on the field. He is set to break out. The guy has played in 100% of his NFL games his first 2 seasons, and now he gets a quarterback in Aaron Rodgers who just doesn't lead his wide receivers into dangerous spots on the field. Now, to emphasize even more how bad the quarterback situation was last year, check this out. Catchable targets, only 68%, 67.9 to be exact, of Garrett Wilson's targets were catchable. That was dead last in the NFL amongst receivers. Over 30% of the targets Garrett Wilson was getting last year, so you figure he had 168 targets. I'm trying to do the quick math right now. Like 55 targets, over 55 weren't even catchable. They were pointless. But now you're replacing those quarterbacks in the uncatchable passes with Aaron Rodgers, who despite getting older, off of a torn Achilles, all these things, this is a guy who is going to be more accurate than dead last in the NFL. Especially when you consider the reports coming out of camp right now that him and Garrett Wilson are gelling. Makes sense. He's the best receiver on this team, but also that the offensive line is giving Aaron Rodgers more time than he's ever had, maybe in his career. Because no offensive line improved more this offseason than the New York Jets. A borderline bottom 5 unit last year, definitely a bottom 5 unit. Now they're a top 5 unit for PFF. They're definitely a top 10 unit no matter which site is ranking them. They added Tyron Smith, when healthy, still one of the best tackles in the league. They traded for Morgan Moses, who they had a couple years ago, and he was great in his own right. And they already have some talented players coming back from injury on this team. Not to mention spending a first-round pick on tackle Olu Fashanu out of Penn State. Like, the offensive line is going to be healthy. If you're giving Aaron Rodgers time back there, I don't care if he's 55 years old, that's going to lead to success. And Wilson's competition, it's been improved this offseason, but it's nothing crazy. Like, Mike Williams, I think, is a talented player if he can stay healthy. He's now 30 off of a torn ACL, so we have to be realistic there. Malachi Corley, a lot of hype out of him, great after the catch in college, but kind of this gadgety guy on a lot of screens, 3rd-round pick. Alan Lazard, okay, we know what we have in Alan Lazard, a glorified, like, wide receiver who's a tight end, a blocker mostly for the most part, will be on the field for that. It's still the Garrett Wilson show in terms of earning targets downfield, intermediate parts of the field. And we know that Aaron Rodgers loves to just focus on one receiver if he can and target them 140 to 150 plus times. You see Devontae Adams more recently as of late. You see even Jordy Nelson before that earlier on in Rodgers' career as a starter, and now it should be Garrett Wilson. Now the next guy on this list has been sort of like a trendier breakout candidate. We've talked about him early in the offseason, and it's Zamir White, and I think that there's a pretty good case for him entering 2024 to be that type of player, a guy who can really break out and win leagues. I mean, that's why he's on this list after all. And if you look at the offseason that he had, not many running backs had a better offseason than Zamir White. Because we can pull up the team pages here in the fantasy blueprint, and you can see that the big one here is that Josh Jacobs is gone. Okay, Josh Jacobs is gone, so that leaves open an opportunity for Zamir White to come in. Who did they bring in to replace Jacobs? Well, not much. Alexander Mattison, who was cut by the Vikings, highly inefficient last year, and then a 6th-round running back in Dylan Lobb, who comes over from a small school, mostly known as a pass-catching back. So you're looking at these pieces of competition, and really no talented guys behind him, guys that are going to threaten for a role, especially when you compare them to Zamir White's skill set and background. And then you check out the offensive line, and in the draft, they end up getting out of Oregon Jackson Powers Johnson, which is a nice pick when you pair him up with a Colton Miller. Colton Miller, who is a rising talent, you can say, in the NFL, one of probably the best offensive linemen and tackles that we saw in the NFL last year, very quietly. So this is an offensive line that wasn't by far the best last year, definitely was not, but now a little bit on the rise. And if you can just get closer to average as an offensive line in the NFL, that's going to be a situation where average, honestly, is all you need. At least when you're talking about it from a fantasy perspective, to not just tank that running back behind that line season. So these are a couple of checks in the right direction for Zamir White, but it keeps getting better. Because the Raiders are practically the only team in camp right now that have a quarterback battle, but between Aiden O'Connell and a second-year player and Gardner Minshew, who they signed but didn't give a ton of money overall. They're in camp right now, but neither of them are that great. Neither of these guys give me the confidence to say, oh, the Raiders are going to throw a lot more this year. Especially when we consider that Luke Getsy is now the quarterback here. He spent some time in Chicago the last couple seasons, and it's really hard to say, like, what was the situation with Getsy's offense? Was it his fault? Was it the fact that we scroll down here and you can see some of his career stuff, Chicago offensive coordinator the last 2 years? Was it the fact that just Justin Fields wasn't all that great? The offensive pieces around him weren't all that great outside of DJ Moore? It's hard to know what Luke Getsy really wants to do with his offense, but we do know that Antonio Pierce, the head coach of the Raiders, wants to play old school football, defense and run the ball a lot. And this is a coach in Antonio Pierce that last year, even when they were winning games, if Josh Jacobs didn't get 20 carries, he would go to the podium and say, we have to get Jacobs 20 plus carries next game, and be like, Matt. Now for Zamir White himself, a lot of people I think are kind of underrating his talent. They're just thinking that this guy's like an older player. I mean, he's literally entering his third year in the NFL. This is a guy who in college at Georgia never got a full workload because, look, it was just a talented backfield. He was competing with James Cook, who was a pass catching back. You can see 140, 160 carries. This was after having a couple of knee injuries in high school and to start his college career. But despite this, the guy is still putting up over 850 yards, nearly 800 yards, averaging over 6 yards per carry in college in an offense that was good for sure and had a good offensive line in Georgia. But still, he was putting up the production and he has the profile. Because this is a guy who's about 220 pounds. He has nice 4.4 speed. He can break tackles, has power. And we got to see this in 4 starts last year at the end of the year when Josh Jacobs was hurt. In those games, Zamir White averaged over 100 total yards per week and 24 opportunities per game. And not to mention, he also showed that he can catch passes, something that he didn't really do in college because he was competing with James Cook, a much better pass catching running back. But last year, if you see, to start the season, this is when Josh Jacobs was starting. Look, you're going to have 1 reception and then just a bunch of zeros. Okay. But at the end of the year, when he actually starts to get to take over and be the running back out there, a 3-catch game and a 5-catch game, this is at least a little bit of upside, 13 catches in those final 4 weeks or so, to show you that if he can add 2-3 receptions a game, 35, 45 reception season, definitely going to be smashing as a league winner where he goes in drafts. So despite Zamir White rising a little bit in drafts, he's still a nice pick in round 7, and he kind of fits my philosophy as a strategy we've talked about in a previous video, the number 1 draft strategy for this year, to be taking running backs, or at least leaning running backs in round 7 through 9. Now, before we get into a wide receiver who might be my favorite wide receivers to draft in all of fantasy football right now, I have to let you know about the fantasy blueprint, which I've already seen thousands of people getting. But if you're not familiar with it, if you want to win your fantasy league, it is very simple. You just click this button to get access, and it will take you to this page right here where you can get the fantasy blueprint completely risk-free this year through 2 of our partners. We have 2 partners this year that you can get it risk-free through, and here's what it means. It means you get all the tools in the blueprint, and there's a ton of them to help you with your draft in every single week during the season. So this is not just for your draft season, the entire year, all 18 weeks throughout your fantasy playoffs and championship. You can get all those tools completely risk-free, meaning that if you do not make your fantasy playoffs, I just refund the one-time payment of $10. So $10 for the entire year to get all that, to beat your friends, to have a massive leg up on them, to not have to do as much research as you probably usually do. And if you don't make your playoffs, I just refund it to you, no questions asked, completely risk-free. If you want to join the over 10,000 people, and we're closing in on about 12,000 people who have used and are currently using the blueprint, scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below. Now, that wide receiver I was talking about, assuming he still goes in round 4 or even early round 5 of your drafts, is going to be Malik Nabers. If you're not familiar with him, he was the Giants' number 1 pick, and let me catch you up to speed. Not only was he the Giants' number 1 pick, but he was taken 6th overall in the NFL draft as one of the best wide receiver prospects we've seen come out in the last 10 to 15 years. And if you look at the guys who get taken in the top 10 picks at the wide receiver position, these guys are not busting all that often, especially recently. You can see very recently, Garrett Wilson, Devonta Smith. You can pull up a little bit over here, Drake London. You can pull up even more over here, Mike Williams, Mike Evans. These are guys, Jalen Waddle, Julio Jones, even Corey Davis had a late career resurgence. Justin Blackmon was great until his own downfall, not because of his skill set. Jamar Chase, AJ Green, Sammy Watkins, everybody on here. I mean, there's a couple of guys who aren't going to make it, but those guys are not the same profile as Malik Nabers. They're your John Rosses, your smaller speedster guys. That's not Malik Nabers. This guy wins on route running and explosiveness after the catch. Now, Malik Nabers last year in college is when he massively broke out, but even the year before that, he was finding success despite this dealing with other great wide receivers in his pass catching core. He had a 1,000-yard season, but last year with Jayden Daniels in that Heisman year for Daniels, over almost 1,600 total yards, earned 32% of the targets despite playing next to another first-round pick who went to the Jaguars and Brian Thomas Jr. I mean, this guy, like I said, as good as it gets in LSU against the SEC defenses with some of the best defensive backs in the NFL or the college football. College football, you get what I mean, the SEC, good defensive backs. All right, let's move on. Now, one big reason why you're not seeing him go earlier is because of the fact that Daniel Jones is returning as his quarterback, maybe Drew Lock at some point this year. I do think, no doubt about it, it's going to be Daniel Jones, and I really don't think Daniel Jones has gotten a good rep. I mean, look, this is a guy who's coming off of an injury last year. The year before that, he was one of the most accurate and efficient passers in his first year with Brian Daboll, believe it or not, and he's never had a true alpha receiver like Malik Nabers. And like I said, Brian Daboll, the coach here, is a guy who just targets his number 1 receiver. We're talking about Stephon Diggs getting 150 plus target seasons every single year when he actually has an alpha, and I think Malik Nabers can be that type of player and even more, a little bit more athletic and faster than a Stephon Diggs. And when you look at the competition, there's really no playmakers with Saquon Barkley and Darren Waller gone from this Giants team. Darren Waller retired, Saquon Barkley on the Eagles, if you're not familiar, but Malik Nabers' competition, Wan'Dale Robinson. I think he's a great late round option in fantasy, a short area player guy, more of a gadget after the catch type of player. Darius Slayton, we know what this 32-year-old is at this point. Jalen Hyatt, a downfield option mostly. I don't really think that I'm going to see much out of his game other than that. Allen Robinson, Isaiah McKenzie, these are like depth pieces if they even make the team. It's really just Malik Nabers. If you're talking about a guy who's going to not only move the chains, score touchdowns as well, and win downfield with explosive 20-plus yard plays, that's Malik Nabers. Now, the one area where I am concerned, as you can see PFF's offensive line rankings right here, the Giants' offensive line was bad last year. It's bad again this year. We have Jermaine Illuminor added in free agency, dealt with a early camp injury, but he says he's good, and John Runyon from the Packers, but none of these guys are like outstanding starters for those teams that they're coming from. The big concern is their offensive line. They still have Andrew Thomas, the best player on this offensive line. Evan Neal, who's a top 10 pick. He's just been a bust for them. This is my concern, because if Daniel Jones doesn't have time to find one Malik Nabers, that's where some things can fall apart. Is the line that bad that will happen? As of right now, I don't think so, but there is a potential for it to be that bad. All right, now next up, we got to talk about the quarterback position, because there's a couple of must-have quarterbacks this year, but we have to talk about the guy that I'm trying to get in every single draft. But before we get there, we have to discuss the overall general strategy of the quarterback position. You only want to be targeting mobile quarterbacks. It's just as simple as that. Do not waste your picks on these pocket passer type guys. And now I know what you're thinking, but Sal, Kirk Cousins is in a great offense now, and he's going to pass the ball a ton, and their defense will stink till after throw. And then you have Joe Burrow, and he's going to throw to Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and all this. You don't want these guys. Simply put, pocket passers just don't win your weekly matchups, and you can look none other than Tua Tagovailoa last year. Tua Tagovailoa last season led the NFL in passing yards per game on the Dolphins. You scroll over here, he was 5th in passing touchdowns. Okay, literally as good as it gets. Where does he finish in fantasy football last year? The quarterback 16. Not a top 10 quarterback, not a top 12, not even a top 15. The quarterback's 16. Why is this? Because the guy averaged 4 rushing yards per game. So you could literally be maybe the best passer last year in terms of yards and touchdown combination, and it doesn't even matter because you have no mobility. Instead, you want to be targeting the elite mobile upside guys. And a lot of the times, these guys go earlier in drafts, like Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts going in round 3 now. Last year, he went in round 2, so you're getting a discount. Lamar Jackson goes in round 4. Last year, he goes in round 3, so you're getting a discount. If you can't get any of these guys, the guy who is a must-have player is right here. It is Kyler Murray. As the quarterback 10 somehow. I think he's a borderline top 5 option, if not a top 5 option. Goes as the 71st player off the board in round 7. Kyler Murray is the number 1 must-have quarterback. And it's just plain and simple for the reasons we've already stated. This guy has mobility, and the offense is improving, but let's just look at his quarterback finishes right here. Quarterback 4, quarterback 7. Last year would have been another quarterback 7 or 8 finish because of the rushing yards. You're getting mobile touchdowns. Last year he didn't play a bunch of games. That's why this is only 244. But more often than not, you're going to get 400 at a minimum. He missed some games in these seasons as well, but more likely 500 plus rushing yards, and it's just hard to overcome that for any pocket passer. This is a guy in Kyler Murray who's averaged at least 30 rushing yards per game in his career, and on average 5.2 touchdowns on the ground per season. And now you factor in that he's another year removed from his ACL tear, not last year but the year before, and he's staying in camp now that he feels way more mobile, and he actually has an alpha wide receiver finally. And that alpha wide receiver was the number 4 overall pick in Marvin Harrison Jr. out of Ohio State. Marvin Harrison Jr. easily the best wide receiver, probably already. DeAndre Hopkins very close, so maybe I'm being a little bit crazy, but Hopkins missed a lot of games with the Cardinals and Kyler Murray, but right there neck and neck with Hopkins is probably the best wide receiver talent that Kyler Murray's ever played with. That sounds crazy, but it's just not. This is how good Marvin Harrison is. So you're getting an upgraded receiver core, not only with Marvin Harrison. They're saying big things about Greg Dortch. I do think he could be a solid player out of the slot. Year 2 for Michael Wilson, who doesn't have to be a number 1 receiver like he did last year for them, can settle in as a wide receiver 2 or 3. A veteran in Zay Jones was added. And then you also have Trey McBride, who I think is getting a little bit overrated based on what he did last year. On film, wasn't really a guy who can do much after the catch. At least he didn't show that last year, but a talented player who can get open nonetheless and catch passes. So this is a much more improved offense. In year 2 under offensive coordinator Drew Pensing, who had a pretty solid offense last year, everything's coming together for a healthier Kyler Murray. Now, the one downside I do have for this team is the offensive line, but they have done some things. They've added Evan Brown and Jonah Williams in free agency. Now, I'm not too fond. I don't think those guys are anything crazy. This was an offensive line that was one of the worst units in the NFL last year, but adding a couple of free agency pieces, adding some depth pieces in the NFL draft, it's a fingers crossed type of thing that can help. But even if it doesn't, maybe it just leads to even more scrambles and more games of 50 plus rushing yards for Kyler Murray. All right, next up we get to Isiah Pacheco, who, if we're talking about maybe the most ideal running back situation for a running back that you can draft in round 3 of fantasy right now, nothing gets better than Isiah Pacheco. And even if he was to fall up and rise into the second round, the late second round of drafts, I still think he's a nice option because of this right over here. Look where he goes currently in drafts. Around some wide receivers who, in my opinion, there's a tier break between Mike Evans, Brandon Ayuk, and the guys that are above them in drafts. And in round 3, you're really not going to find as good of a running back, or late round 2 compared to guys like, you scroll up here, Travis Etienne, Devon A-Chain. I'd much rather have Isiah Pacheco for a couple of reasons we're about to state. And we can start with that his current situation is as good as it gets. And it's a little bit obvious whenever you're paired up with Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid on a Super Bowl winning team, yeah, the offense is going to be good. And this is a team that actually improved this offseason, believe it or not, their offense. A first round pick in Xavier Worthy, Marquise Brown was added. These are speedy wide receivers who can target downfield. In training camp right now, they're saying that they're throwing the ball more downfield with an emphasis, and that's normally help the backfield in Isiah Pacheco. If the defenses are worrying more about the deep pass, there's more check down opportunities and more running opportunities against zone for a running back like Pacheco. All right, so the situation in offense looks good. Well, how about the offensive line? Well, ever since the 2021 Super Bowl, the Bucs versus versus the Chiefs when the Bucs won. Patrick Mahomes was getting slammed at every single play almost because the offensive line was banged up and not good. Ever since then, this team has had top units every year, and they're going to have another top 10 unit this year when you're talking about, look at this right here. I mean, Joe Thuney, as good as it gets if you're talking about any type of offensive lineman in the NFL. You're talking about Creed Humphrey, maybe the best center in the NFL. Juwan Taylor, if he's going to be your third or fourth best offensive lineman, that is very, very solid. So you're going to have definitely an above average offensive line and an above average offense for sure. Top 10 unit for probably both of those things that we just mentioned, which is going to help your running backs in Pacheco. So he's checking boxes a lot right now. And then we get to the competition where Clyde Edwards-Helaire will be coming back on a one-year deal. That's probably his biggest competition in camp right now. He looks like the RB2. After that, it's Keontae Ingram, like a journeyman, might get cut back up for the Cardinals in his career. Deneric Prince, who's an undrafted player. Isiah Pacheco easily beat him out last year. And Jerick McKinnon is actually gone, which is a good thing right now because McKinnon was a pass catching back. They didn't bring him back this season. And Pacheco already had a career high 44 catches last year. And according to reports, right now in training camp, he had all off season a wide receiver coach helping him catch passes because they want to increase his role as a pass catcher. And I mean, if this role as a pass catcher increases, it's wheels up because as a runner last year, in his second year as a former 7th round pick, he was already great. He ranked 11th in breakaway run rate, 12th in yards created, and averaged 4.7 yards per touch. And it only got better over the final 9 games of the season when he was averaging 21 touches per game and was a top 5 fantasy back. Look, the profile is great. He's 216 pounds. Now he's playing closer to around 220 pounds. He has 4.37 speed, and he has just no competition in a great offense like this. And last season, again, a career high 44 catches with those receptions only increasing even more the second half of the year and into the postseason. So Pacheco is checking. That's kind of like a nice little thing there. All the boxes for us as a must-have running back in round 3. And even if you want to comment and say he goes in round 2 in my draft, fine. He's a must-have there too. Now the next guy up is a running back in Detroit. And last year, David Montgomery. This was a guy going in like round 8, maybe round 9 early in the summer of fantasy drafts. And he was a fantasy darling. He was a sexy late round pick. And he paid off for people. But now he's going in round 7 or round 8 and nobody wants him. I don't get it. He fits my philosophy of targeting running backs who go in round 7 through 9. Leaning those guys because the wide receivers in those range rarely have a top 12 season as opposed to the running backs who more often do. And now I know the obvious thing people will say is, oh, Zamir Gibbs is there. But Zamir Gibbs was there last year going as like a 3rd round pick in fantasy drafts. Zamir Gibbs had a good season and David Montgomery still had a solid year last year. This is a guy who averaged 80 yards per game, had 13 touchdowns, was very productive, but now basically goes in the same round of drafts because people think Zamir Gibbs is all of a sudden going to become like a workhorse every down back. I don't see it. Because that Montgomery production of 80 yards a game and 13 touchdowns was enough last year to finish as a top 15 back. And even in the second half of the season, he was productive with Zamir Gibbs earning a larger role. This is Montgomery's game logs on Player Profiler. You can see the fantasy points. It's the points he scored in the place that he finished amongst running backs that week. Look at this right here. 16th, 21st, 2nd, 5th. Then he gets injured, so it's 45th. He left that game early, so it's skewed. Then he comes back from injury. 12th, 13th, 15th, 17th, 26th. I mean, we can keep scrolling here. 15, 22nd, 7, 9. And then in the playoffs, he puts up a 19-point performance. He had such great performances every week. He had a top 24 finish or better in nearly 90% of his games last year while playing alongside Zamir Gibbs for all of those games. And now he's entering a second year in this offense under the same offensive coordinator who fed him last year. And they have the #1 offensive line in football, according not only to PFF, but a lot of people and myself. Penei Sewell might be the best offensive tackle in the entire NFL. They still have Frank Ragnow. They brought in Kevin Zeitler to replace Jonah Jackson, who left in free agency. They still have Graham Glasgow and Decker. I mean, this offensive line, every single member on it would probably be the best player on like 20 other offensive lines in the league, and they have 5 of those guys or better. And like I said, they're getting right back into the same offense as last year under one Ben Johnson, the offensive coordinator, which saw the Lions last year lead the NFL in rushing touchdowns with 27, and over the last 2 seasons, they have led the NFL in red zone touches for their running backs and red zone touchdowns. So even if Zamir Gibbs ends up being a top 10 running back this year, like where he's getting drafted, I still think David Montgomery, even if Gibbs has a great season, Montgomery is still going to earn 12 to 14 plus carries a game, get a lot of red zone usage in an offense behind this great offensive line that was solid last year, got to the Final Four. I think Montgomery can easily finish as a top 20 running back yet again, but he goes after that in drafts. Now, before we get on to the next 2 players in this video, and this next quarterback is probably the latest you're going to see a league-winning quarterback go, I just want to let you know, over 60% of you are not subscribed to this channel. It takes 2 seconds to subscribe. The goal is by week 1 to get that number to 50%. And again, a lot of you just might not know it. I probably don't subscribe on half the channels until I get that little urge to, so here's your urge. Appreciate it a ton. Now, that quarterback that I'm talking about, who probably has the most league-winning upside, realistically has top 5 quarterback upside, but goes right around pick 100, is Jayden Daniels, the Washington Commanders rookie quarterback. Look, it's hard not to like this guy. He goes with a top 5 pick overall in the draft, and honestly, he's not going to the worst situation in terms of talent around him. If you look at Jayden Daniels right now, this is the team that he's dealing with. Terry McLaurin, a great wide receiver. Jahan Dotson, I believe a solid wide receiver. That's a nice 2 wide receiver option, better than what most guys go into their rookie year at quarterback. Now, there are reports out of camp that the quarterback situation, it is a battle between him and Marcus Mariota, but let's be real here. It's not going to be Marcus Mariota's job if Jayden Daniels is healthy after the preseason. Now, the reason why Daniels has all this upside, as you can see his college career, is one thing: mobility. You can see right away when he's young at 18, he's running for 355 yards at Arizona State. But really, these last 2 years at LSU, 885 yards, over 1,100 yards last year in his Heisman winning season. That's 94 yards per game. But college football does this wonky thing where if you get sacked, they count that as negative rushing yards. If you took those out, he was averaging over 110 rushing yards per game last year, Jayden Daniels. And now he goes to an offense in Washington that has Cliff Kingsbury as an offensive coordinator, which is important because Cliff Kingsbury dealt with, for 4 years in Arizona, Kyler Murray. And now these guys are nowhere near the same type of player, but they do have mobile upside. And as we showed earlier with Kyler Murray, this is a guy who, under Cliff Kingsbury, for his first 4 seasons, finished as the quarterback 11 as a rookie, then quarterback 3, quarterback 4, and quarterback 7 in a season where he got injured. But more importantly, he let him run. Cliff Kingsbury let him run. 11 touchdowns, over 800 yards, over 500 yards, 4 touchdowns. This is going to be the Jayden Daniels show this year. Outside of Lamar Jackson, he might be the most talented runner of the football at the quarterback position right now in the NFL. Now, another running back that we have to talk about who you can get in round 4 or 5 of your fantasy drafts is a must-have option. And look, I'll say it. He's an aging running back. I get it. This is a guy who is now 28 years old. A lot of people don't like guys who are over 26 or 27. Joe Mixon, though, this situation hard to ignore. Because I don't think Joe Mixon is this old washed-up running back. No, he was traded to the Texans. They wanted him, so they traded for him, and then immediately signed him to a 3-year deal. And you can see right here, that 3-year deal was pretty significant. Not only was it a 3-year deal, they gave him $13 million in guaranteed money. For this day and age at the running back position, that's a lot. And nearly $20 million overall for, again, a guy who's 28 years old. They have this much confidence in Joe Mixon. And now Mixon enters an offense that should only be improving. I mean, last year they were great with C.J. Stroud breaking out and guys like Tank Dell and Nico Collins there, and now they've even added Stephon Diggs to the offense. They should be able to move the ball downfield, get into the red zone, set up some rushing touchdowns. And not to mention, last year their offensive line started with 4 guys injured, 3 starters and 1 depth piece, 4 guys injured. So they had a tough season overall, but that's changed because now these guys are actually healthy. And although they're not going to be a top 10 unit, we're hoping for them to be an average unit this year. They still have an elite player on that offensive line in Laramie Tunsil, and another solid player if you look at PFF right here, and Shaq Mason, who is as reliable as they come in terms of offensive line pieces. If they get anything out of the other pieces that they added this year, they'll probably be an average unit, which is more than enough what we need for a fantasy running back in Joe Mixon. And I'll be the first to admit that Joe Mixon is aging. The last 2 years, he was not efficient on a per-touch basis, but was still a top 10 running back each season because coaches trust him and put him on the field a lot. The dude can catch passes and pass protect, which is basically things that the other guys in this backfield can't do. Dameon Pierce, not known for catching passes, wasn't efficient last year. Jawar Jordan, a late-round rookie, having a nice camp so far, but are they going to trust a late-round rookie over the guy they gave $20 million to in all situations like third downs and pass protections and pass catching? I don't think they're going to trust Jawar Jordan. So I think what you're getting is another workhorse running back role for Joe Mixon, and that's exactly what his coach said. Bobby Sloak, the offensive coordinator, said recently in camp that he is an absolute workhorse running back, and he's got like giddy. He started laughing and smiling, so I think you're going to get exactly that for Joe Mixon this year. A workhorse running back that you can take in round 4 of your fantasy drafts, sometimes falls to round 5. I'm completely fine getting like a running back in round 1, then like 3 receivers in a row, and then getting Joe Mixon in round 5 if you can. That's a great start. So these dudes are must-have players. There's 10 of them for fantasy this year. But if you want to see how to dominate your first 5 rounds of your draft with my top 50 rankings, well, check out this beautiful, there it is. This beautiful video right here will help you with the top 50 picks, your first 5 rounds of your drafts. Best of luck, everybody. I'll see you all in the next one.